He hadn't been searching for anything in particular that day, just unpacking slowly, without urgency, letting the rhythm of movement distract him from the silence of the unfamiliar space. The house was small and slightly crooked, with floors that sloped inward just enough to feel intentional, though the landlord had insisted it was only the foundation settling with age. It had been built sometime in the 40s, he guessed, based on the odd proportions of the doors and the brittle weight of the light switches, and though the previous tenants had left it mostly empty, the attic still held boxes sealed with tape so brittle it cracked like dry skin. He told himself he'd leave them untouched, that whatever had been left behind was not his concern, but boredom often pulls the hand before thought can restrain it, and so he found himself opening one of the boxes late that afternoon, the sun already low, the air stale with the smell of dust and insulation. Inside were mostly papers, old bills, a torn instruction manual for a microwave no longer present, and beneath them, a thin stack of black and white photographs held together by a rubber band that broke the moment he touched it. The photos were unremarkable, grainy shots of rooms, furniture, a few faded portraits of people he didn't recognize, likely long dead, but one image pulled at his attention like a whisper from a darkened hallway. It was a photograph of the living room. His living room. The same fireplace, the same crooked mantel, the same narrow window above the radiator, but in the corner, near the edge of the frame, just barely visible where the shadows met the baseboard, there was something else. A shape. It wasn't clear, not really, more of a smudge than a form, but darker than shadow, shaped like a person hunched over or folded inward, as if trying not to be seen and failing. It lacked detail, but not presence. The moment he saw it, his skin tightened, not in fear, but in instinct, the kind that rises before reason, the kind that says this is not supposed to be here. He studied the photo for a long time, unsure what unsettled him more, the vague shape itself, or the feeling that it had been looking directly at the camera, even as its face was lost in the blur. He left the picture on the counter and went about the rest of his evening without mentioning it aloud, though it remained in his thoughts like a weight he couldn't shift. That night, the living room felt different. Not colder, not darker, just changed, as if the space had noticed his attention, as if it had grown aware of itself through his recognition. He didn't look at the corner where the shape had been in the photo, not directly, but every time he walked past it, he felt the urge to glance sideways, not to confirm, but to avoid confirming. He told himself it was just an old photograph. A trick of exposure. A shadow misread by the lens. But then it began to appear in the house. Not in obvious ways, not walking, not standing in plain view, but in the edge of his vision, in the moment his eyes left a room, or in the fraction of a second between turning his head and arriving at the new angle. A darkness, faint and low, crouched or slumped, always in a corner, never clearly visible, never directly seen, and always gone the moment he tried to look at it. At first, he thought it was stress, or perhaps something left over from the sleep debt he'd been building for months. But the sensations became more specific, the air would shift slightly when he passed through certain parts of the room, the floorboards would creak in places he wasn't standing, the corners of the ceiling would feel heavier, as if something pressed downward from above. The worst part was the way the photograph began changing. He had left it on the kitchen counter, face up, untouched. But 2 nights later, the shape was clearer. Not by much, not suddenly or dramatically, but undeniably clearer. The curve of a shoulder was now visible. A tilt of a head. The shadow had sharpened, just slightly, as if whatever had been blurry was coming into focus over time. And he knew, though he had no way to explain how, that the figure in the photograph and the one he saw in the corners of his vision were the same. It had never left the house. It had only been waiting to be seen. He began avoiding corners, not intentionally at first, but through subtle shifts in movement, pausing slightly before entering rooms, repositioning furniture so that no part of the wall met at a perfect angle, leaving lights on even in daylight, as if brightness could interrupt the formation of whatever it was that had taken root in the folds of shadow where geometry allowed it to rest. The figure never showed itself directly, never stepped forward, never approached in the traditional sense, and yet he began to feel its closeness in ways more visceral than visual, in the way silence changed in its presence, growing deeper, not through the absence of sound but through the absorption of it, like fabric stretched over something breathing just beneath its surface. The photograph was no longer a photograph. It had become something else, not a memory, not an image, but a record of progression, a frame-by-frame unveiling of a thing that did not belong to light or time. Each day, it changed, imperceptibly at first, a shift in posture, a darkening of edges, and then more obviously, the head now clearly tilted toward the camera, the limbs more defined, the suggestion of hands that rested unnaturally close to the floor, long-fingered, wrong in proportion. He never touched it again, not because he feared what would happen if he did, but because he feared what wouldn't, that it would remain warm, or pulsing, or heavier than it should be. He stopped using certain rooms altogether. The living room, once the center of quiet evenings and half-forgotten routines, had become unbearable, not because of what he saw, but because of what he almost saw. The corners of that room behaved differently now. He could sense them shifting when he wasn't looking, reshaping themselves to allow something space. He once stood with his back to the wall and felt, with perfect clarity, that the angle behind him had widened slightly, no longer 90 degrees, no longer architectural, as if the house were subtly realigning to accommodate the shape of what had been hiding in its margins. Sleep became fragmented. He would close his eyes and wake not in bed but standing in a hallway with no memory of how he had arrived there, the lights flickering, the corners of the walls vibrating faintly, almost imperceptibly, like the muscles of a throat preparing to swallow. He began hearing sounds without source, the shuffle of fabric in an empty room, the dull exhale of breath behind the closed bathroom door, the faint knock of knuckles against drywall that pulsed once and then stopped, always once, always followed by silence. One morning he found all the corners in the house marked with something, not drawn, not painted, but discolored slightly, as though the wall had been pressed from the inside. The color was not red, not black, not anything identifiable, just darker, denser, as if the material of the world had been compressed there, condensed by the weight of attention. He tried to leave, not out of panic but out of instinct, the same way an animal flees fire before seeing the flame. He packed quickly, choosing nothing meaningful, filling a duffel bag with the mechanics of daily life, wallet, phone, keys, charger, a sweater, but when he opened the front door, the light outside felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not dramatic. Just wrong. The sky was not the color it had been the day before. The wind moved the trees without sound. The distance between the house and the horizon looked thinner, as if depth itself had been compromised. He closed the door and sat on the stairs for hours. The bag remained near the threshold, untouched. The house had already taken him. It hadn't done so violently. It hadn't screamed or shifted or broken. It had absorbed him slowly, steadily, by offering him glimpses of something not meant to be glimpsed, and then waiting for him to look again. He understood now that the figure had never arrived. It had always been part of the house, woven into its structure, folded into the negative spaces where two surfaces met, activated only by awareness. The photograph had not captured it, it had only reminded the house that it could be seen. And now, he was being seen. Not just by the figure, but by the angles themselves. By the corners that lengthened slightly when he passed them. By the shadows that no longer needed light to exist. By the silence that now breathed louder than sound. He tried once more to fight it, in the way a drowning man kicks at water, irrational, desperate, automatic. He tore the photograph into pieces, burned the pieces, crushed the ash into the sink. He dismantled the light fixtures, flooded the rooms with music, painted the corners white, wide, soft, but the paint peeled by morning, the music reversed its tone, the lights flickered again, and the pieces of the photograph reappeared on the kitchen counter, unburned, whole, slightly clearer. On the final night, though he could no longer count days with any certainty, he stood in the hallway and saw the figure directly. Not in the corner. Not in the reflection. But in the open space, standing still, facing him. The limbs were too long. The head slightly sloped. The absence of eyes more intimate than a gaze. It didn't move. It didn't threaten. It only occupied, as if his body and presence had become the final corner the house required to complete itself. And then it was morning. The sun rose normally. The sky resumed its color. The rooms were empty. The bed remained made. The refrigerator hummed quietly. There was no sound of panic, no sign of departure. Only the photograph remained, now placed neatly on the table. It was the same image as before, the living room, the window, the fireplace. But the figure was gone. And in its place, crouched in the corner of the room, just visible where the shadows thickened near the floor, was the outline of a man, slumped forward, limbs tucked in tightly, head lowered, still. No longer the shadow. Now the occupant. And the house waits again, for someone to see it.